Priscilla Presley had learned over the years that silence could be louder than any argument. It could press against the chest, sink into the bones, and linger long after the sound of a slammed door or raised voice had faded. On that August afternoon in Los Angeles, the silence inside her living room felt thick and unyielding, as if the air itself were resisting her breath. Outside, the city moved on in its usual indifference, cars passing, distant sirens, the low hum of life continuing. But inside the walls of her home, time felt suspended. The phone rested on the small table beside the couch, unmoving now, though it had been ringing relentlessly for days. Each unanswered call left behind a residue of tension, a quiet reminder that some things, once ignored, did not simply disappear. Priscilla sat still, her posture composed but strained, hands folded together in a way that suggested restraint rather than calm. This was not indecision, it was exhaustion. She had spent years responding to emergencies that never truly resolved, years being pulled back into emotional storms she did not create but was expected to weather. After the divorce, after the long and painful process of carving out a separate identity, she had promised herself that her life would no longer revolve around someone else's chaos. Boundaries had not come easily to her. They were learned slowly, through disappointment, through heartbreak, through the quiet realization that love alone could not fix what addiction and denial refused to confront. Saying no had once felt cruel to her. Now it felt necessary. The phone rang again earlier that day, and she had watched it without moving, letting it echo until it stopped. She already knew who it would be. The names did not change, only the urgency in the voices. There was always urgency. There was always a reason why this time was different, why this moment could not wait, why she needed to drop everything and return to a world she had fought so hard to step away from. Each message carried the same weight, the same unspoken expectation. That she would come, that she would soothe, that she would somehow make things better simply by being present. It was a role she had played for too long, and one she no longer believed in. What haunted her most was not the calls themselves, but the memories they stirred. She remembered other nights, other cities, other moments when the phone rang and she answered without hesitation, heart already racing, mind already preparing to fix what could not be fixed. She remembered pleading conversations, tearful promises, reassurances that things would change if only she stayed, if only she tried harder, if only she believed one more time. She remembered the gradual erosion of hope, the slow understanding that love, no matter how sincere, could not compete with a dependence that refused help. Leaving had not been an act of abandonment, it had been an act of survival. As the afternoon wore on, Priscilla's thoughts drifted not to Memphis but inward. She thought of her daughter, of the quiet responsibility she carried now, of the example she wanted to set. She did not want a life defined by reacting to crises, by teaching that love meant sacrificing oneself endlessly. She wanted stability, clarity, and the kind of peace that came from knowing where one stood. Saying no, she told herself, was not cruelty. It was honesty. It was acknowledging the limits of what she could give without losing herself entirely. Still, doubt crept in, as it always did. Doubt had a way of slipping through even the strongest resolve, whispering questions that had no clear answers. What if this time truly was different? What if the urgency in their voices reflected something real rather than habitual panic? What if, by refusing, she was closing a door that could never be reopened? These thoughts did not come from weakness. They came from history, from years of loving someone whose life had been defined by extremes. She had learned to question urgency because urgency had been weaponized against her before, used to draw her back into cycles she had already lived through too many times. When she finally picked up the phone to return the call, her voice was steady, though her heart was not. The conversation unfolded exactly as she expected, each plea following the same pattern, each request layered with emotion and implication. She listened, not because she was undecided, but because listening felt like the last kindness she could offer. When she spoke, her words were firm but measured, chosen carefully to avoid cruelty while remaining unmistakably final. She explained herself not for their sake, but for her own, to hear the truth spoken aloud, to reinforce the decision she had already made. Ending the call did not bring relief. It brought a quiet heaviness, a sense of finality that settled deep within her. She remained seated long after the line went dead, staring at nothing in particular, aware that she had crossed an invisible threshold. This was not just another refusal. It felt different, though she could not yet articulate why. Perhaps it was the tone and the voices she had heard, or perhaps it was simply the accumulation of years pressing down all at once. Either way, she knew that this decision, like so many before it, would not be easily forgotten. As evening approached, the light in the room shifted, shadows lengthening across the floor. Priscilla moved slowly, as if each step required conscious effort. She poured herself a glass of water, drank it absent-mindedly, and tried to distract herself with routine tasks that suddenly felt meaningless. No matter what she did, her thoughts circled back to the same place. The unanswered calls, the unspoken words, the unresolved past. She reminded herself again why she had said no, replaying her reasons like a mantra. She had done everything she could. She had tried. She had stayed longer than many would have. Protecting herself now was not selfish, it was overdue. Yet when the phone rang again that night, something in her shifted. It was not panic, nor was it guilt. It was recognition, a quiet understanding that some moments, once they arrived, carried a weight that could not be ignored. She hesitated before answering, aware that whatever was said next might linger with her far longer than she expected. She did not know it then, but this was the beginning of a reckoning that would stretch far beyond that night, far beyond the boundaries she had drawn so carefully. The choice she had made was real, and it was hers alone. What she did not yet know was how deeply it would echo in the days to come. Night settled slowly over Lowe's Angels, bringing with it a deceptive calm that did nothing to ease the restlessness growing inside Priscilla. The city lights flickered on one by one, distant and impersonal, as if the world beyond her windows existed on an entirely different plane. She moved through her home with quiet deliberation, turning on lamps, closing curtains, performing small rituals meant to signal the end of the day, yet none of it brought the relief she expected. Her mind refused to slow. It kept returning to the same unresolved space, replaying conversations she wished she could forget and imagining words that had not yet been spoken. Boundaries, she reminded herself, were meant to protect, not punish. Still, the emotional cost of enforcing them felt heavier tonight than it ever had before. When the phone rang again, the sound cut through the room with startling clarity, sharper and more personal than before. This was not the persistent ringing of earlier calls, nor the familiar cadence of voices she had already heard. Something about this call felt different, more exposed, as if there were no intermediaries left to soften what was coming. She stared at the phone for a long moment, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen, seeing not just the woman she had become, but the girl she once was, the one who had believed that love could be enough to carry two people through anything. Against her better judgment, she answered. The voice on the other end was quieter than she remembered, stripped of the bravado and performance that had so often accompanied it in the past. There was no attempt to charm, no dramatic flourish meant to pull her back into familiar patterns. Instead, there was a vulnerability that unsettled her, precisely because it did not demand anything outright. It spoke not with urgency alone, but with an awareness of consequence, as though the speaker understood that this conversation might be the last opportunity to say certain things aloud. Priscilla listened carefully, her grip tightening on the phone as she tried to reconcile the sound of that voice with the memories it carried. She responded cautiously, choosing each word with care, unwilling to surrender the ground she had fought so hard to claim. She repeated what she had already said, reaffirming her decision not to come, not to reopen doors she had closed for her own survival. Yet as she spoke, she felt the familiar tension between compassion and self-preservation rise again, sharper now because it was no longer abstract. This was not a request filtered through others. It was direct, unshielded, and painfully human. The voice on the line did not argue. It did not attempt to negotiate. Instead, it acknowledged her choice with a resignation that frightened her more than anger ever could. What followed was not a plea but a confession. The words were spoken slowly, as if each one required effort, as if saying them aloud made them more real. There was an admission of fear, of physical and emotional decline, of a growing awareness that time was no longer an abstract concept, but a narrowing corridor. Priscilla felt her chest tighten as she listened, torn between skepticism born of experience and an instinctive sense that something fundamental had shifted. She had heard declarations of crisis before, had been summoned back by promises and desperation that ultimately led nowhere. But this felt stripped of strategy, devoid of the manipulative edge she had come to recognize so well. Still, doubt held her firmly in place. She questioned what she was hearing not out of cruelty but out of self-defense. She asked how she could know whether this was truth or simply another moment of heightened emotion. The answer she received offered no reassurance, only honesty. She was told that certainty was impossible, that belief would require risk, and that choosing not to believe would carry its own consequences. There was no pressure in this statement, no demand for compliance. It was an acknowledgement of her autonomy, coupled with an understanding of what her decision might mean. As the conversation unfolded, Priscilla felt herself standing at the edge of something irreversible. She understood with startling clarity that whatever she chose next would follow her long after the call ended. This was not about rescuing or fixing or saving. It was about witnessing, about presence, about whether she could live with the knowledge that she had turned away when asked to be there one final time. The weight of that realization pressed heavily against her resolve, testing the strength of boundaries she had believed unshakable. When the call ended, the silence that followed was unlike any she had experienced before. It was not empty, it was full of implication, dense with unanswered questions and unspoken truths. Priscilla remained seated, the phone still in her hand, as if letting go of it would somehow make everything more real. Sleep did not come easily that night. Her thoughts circled endlessly, revisiting every word she had heard, every emotion she had felt, every reason she had ever had for saying no. She weighed them against the possibility that this time, the stakes were higher than she had allowed herself to admit. Morning arrived without resolution. The light creeping through the curtains felt intrusive, unwelcome, as though the world were demanding an answer she was not yet ready to give. Priscilla moved through the early hours in a haze, her body present but her mind elsewhere, suspended between past and future. She understood that whatever decision she made would define not just this moment, but how she remembered everything that came before it. To go would mean risking the collapse of the boundaries she had built. To stay would mean accepting the possibility of regret so deep it could never be undone. By the time she finally reached for the phone again, it was not with the hope of changing what had already been said, but with the need to assert clarity, to make her choice consciously rather than by default. She spoke calmly, explaining that she had considered everything, that she understood the gravity of what she was refusing, and that she was prepared to live with the consequences. This was not indifference. It was resolve forged through years of hard-earned understanding. She ended the call knowing that there would be no easy way forward from here, only the slow unfolding of whatever this decision would bring. What Priscilla could not yet grasp was how swiftly time would move once the choice was made. Days that felt insignificant in the moment would soon take on a weight she could never have anticipated. The call that ended that morning did not close the chapter she thought it would. Instead, it opened a space where memory, regret, and love would collide, shaping the meaning of everything that followed. And somewhere, far beyond the quiet of her Lowe's Angel's home, the clock was already counting down, indifferent to hesitation, relentless in its advance toward an ending no one could prevent. Time did not rush forward after the decision was made. It crept, deliberate and heavy, as though each hour were aware of its own significance. Priscilla found herself moving through the days that followed with an unusual awareness of small details, the way sunlight shifted across the floor in the morning, the sound of distant traffic late at night, the subtle changes in her own breathing when her thoughts drifted back to that final conversation. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There were no immediate consequences, no sudden sense of relief or devastation. Instead, there was an uneasy quiet, a feeling that something unresolved was hovering just beyond her awareness, waiting patiently for its moment to surface. She told herself that this discomfort was natural, that enforcing boundaries often came with delayed emotional reactions. Years of experience had taught her that saying no did not automatically erase attachment or concern. It simply meant choosing a different response, one that prioritized long-term well-being over immediate emotional relief. Still, the absence of further calls unsettled her more than their persistence ever had. She checked the phone more often than she meant to, not with the intention of reaching out, but with a strange expectation that it might ring again, that the situation would somehow demand reconsideration. When it remained silent, she felt both reassured and disturbed, unsure which emotion made more sense. As the days passed, memories surfaced uninvited. They arrived not as dramatic flashbacks, but as quiet intrusions woven into ordinary moments. A song playing faintly from a passing car, a photograph she stumbled upon while organizing papers, a familiar phrase spoken by a stranger that carried an echo of the past. Each reminder carried with it a question she refused to articulate fully. Had she done the right thing, or had she mistaken self-preservation for finality? She resisted the urge to frame the situation in absolutes. Life, she knew, rarely offered clean moral conclusions. Choices were made with incomplete information, guided by instinct as much as reason. That did not mean they were wrong, only that they carried consequences no one could fully predict. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet counting had begun. She did not consciously mark the days, yet she was aware of time passing in a way that felt different from before, as if an internal clock had been set in motion without her consent. Each morning arrived with a subtle tension, each evening with a lingering sense of incompletion. She wondered how he was spending these same days, whether he felt the same suspended uncertainty, or whether he had already reached a place of acceptance she had not. The thought unsettled her, not because she felt responsible for his state, but because it forced her to confront the reality that her absence was now a fact, not a hypothetical. She spoke to no one about her unease, explaining it felt impossible without reopening the entire history she had worked so hard to move beyond. Friends saw only her composure, mistaking silence for peace. She did not correct them. There was comfort in being misunderstood if understanding required vulnerability she was not ready to offer. In quieter moments, she reminded herself again why she had chosen this path, replaying the long years that had led her here. She had not acted impulsively. She had not been careless. This was the result of sustained reflection, of recognizing patterns that no longer served her life. And yet, the mind had a way of questioning even the most carefully reasoned decisions when confronted with uncertainty. On the 8th day, the phone rang. The sound was sharp, intrusive, and unmistakably final. Priscilla felt it before she understood it, a sudden tightening in her chest that left no room for doubt. She answered without hesitation, her composure dissolving in the instant before the voice on the other end began to speak. The words came slowly, deliberately, carrying a gravity that made the world around her seem distant and unreal. She listened without interruption, absorbing each sentence with a clarity that bordered on disbelief. There was no confusion about what she was being told, no ambiguity. The waiting had ended. When the call ended, Priscilla remained standing, the phone pressed against her ear long after the line went dead. The room felt unfamiliar, as though she had stepped into someone else's life without warning. Sound seemed muted, movement slowed, and for a brief moment, she experienced the strange sensation of watching herself from a distance, aware of her own stillness but unable to change it. The truth settled gradually, not as a sudden wave of emotion, but as a deep, sinking realization that the choice she had made was no longer theoretical. It had intersected with reality in the most permanent way possible. Regret did not arrive immediately, nor did guilt in the form she had anticipated. What came first was understanding, a stark, unembellished awareness of cause and effect. She had been asked to come, she had refused, time had passed, and now whatever words had remained unspoken would remain so forever. This was not a punishment, she reminded herself. It was simply the outcome of two separate truths colliding, her need for boundaries and the fragility of time. Neither negated the other. Both existed simultaneously, inseparable now. As the hours that followed unfolded, Priscilla felt the weight of that realization deepen. She replayed the final conversation not in an attempt to rewrite it, but to understand it more fully. She remembered the tone, the restraint, the absence of accusation. There had been no attempt to coerce her, no anger at her refusal. That more than anything unsettled her. Acceptance, she realized, could be just as final as rejection. The opportunity to reconsider had existed, and she had declined it consciously, believing she was prepared to live with the outcome. In the days that followed, grief took on an unfamiliar shape. It was not the grief of a current partner or an unresolved lover, but the grief of someone who had once been central to her life, someone whose presence had shaped her identity in ways she could never fully disentangle. Alongside sorrow came questions she knew would never be answered, not because they were forbidden, but because time had simply run out. What had he wanted to say? What had he hoped she would understand? These questions did not accuse her. They simply lingered, persistent and unresolved. By the time she prepared to travel, she understood that the story she would carry forward was no longer about refusal alone. It was about the complexity of love after separation, about the limits of responsibility, and about the quiet, often invisible costs of protecting oneself. She had not acted without reason, but reason did not shield her from the emotional weight of the outcome. As she moved toward what awaited her next, she carried with her the knowledge that some decisions, once made, could not be softened by explanation or intent. They could only be lived with. And somewhere within that understanding, the full meaning of those 8 days began to take shape, not as a measure of blame, but as a reminder of how swiftly time could turn possibility into memory and choice into something that could never be undone. The journey back felt longer than any distance Priscilla had traveled before, not because of miles or time zones, but because of what awaited her at the end of it. Every movement toward that place felt symbolic, each step layered with awareness that she was no longer moving toward a conversation, but toward an ending that had already sealed itself into history. She moved through airports and corridors with a quiet composure that masked the storm beneath it, answering questions politely, acknowledging condolences without resistance, yet feeling detached from the mechanics of the world around her. Nothing felt unreal. Instead, everything felt painfully precise, as though each moment were imprinting itself deliberately, ensuring it would never fade. Standing in that familiar space again brought no comfort, only recognition. The environment had not changed in any meaningful way, yet everything about it felt altered, charged with absence. She observed the rituals unfolding around her with careful attention, noting the way people gathered, the way they spoke in hushed tones, the way memory took on a collective form that did not fully belong to any one person. Grief, she realized, was not singular here. It was layered, shared, and often contradictory, shaped by individual relationships that could never be reconciled into one narrative. Her own grief sat quietly among them, distinct and heavy, marked by a knowledge that could not be shared without explanation she did not wish to give. When she finally stood before what remained, the weight of the moment pressed against her with an intensity she had anticipated but could not fully prepare for. This was not the confrontation she had avoided days earlier, nor was it the conversation she had declined. This was something else entirely, the undeniable finality of what could no longer be changed. She did not speak immediately. Words felt inadequate, not because there were none, but because there were too many, layered and conflicting, impossible to untangle into something simple or clean. What she felt was not just sorrow, but the quiet recognition of choice, of agency exercised and consequences accepted. In that stillness, understanding settled more deeply than regret ever could. She saw clearly now that the decision she had made was neither wholly right nor wholly wrong. It was human. It had been shaped by years of experience, by patterns learned and boundaries forged through necessity. She had not acted out of cruelty or indifference, but out of a need to survive a history that had once threatened to consume her. That truth remained valid even now. Yet alongside it existed another truth, equally undeniable. That survival sometimes exacted a cost that revealed itself only after time had closed every alternative. In the weeks and months that followed, Priscilla carried that understanding with her quietly. She did not dramatize it, nor did she attempt to absolve herself through justification. Instead, she allowed the complexity of it to exist without resolution. She learned that regret was not always loud or destructive. Sometimes it was simply present, woven into memory, altering its texture without erasing its meaning. She did not wake each morning consumed by guilt, nor did she forget the reasons that had guided her choice. What she carried was subtler and more enduring, an awareness of how fragile timing could be, how easily opportunity could dissolve into permanence. As years passed, memory softened the sharpest edges of pain, but it never erased the questions that lingered quietly beneath the surface. They did not demand answers anymore. They existed as reminders rather than accusations, shaping her understanding of love, responsibility, and the limits of what one person could give another. She spoke of it rarely, and when she did, her words were careful, stripped of drama, grounded in honesty rather than confession. She did not frame herself as victim or villain, but as someone who had made a choice with the information and strength she had at the time, and who had learned, slowly and irrevocably, what that choice meant. What remained in the end was not a single moment of refusal or a single moment of loss, but the space between them. That space became a lesson she carried forward, influencing how she approached relationships, how she listened, how she recognized the difference between urgency and truth. She understood now that boundaries were essential, but so was discernment, and that knowing when to hold firm and when to step closer was one of the hardest balances a person could learn. She did not resolve this lesson into a rule or principle. She allowed it to remain complicated, as life itself so often was. In quieter moments, when memory surfaced unexpectedly, she did not push it away. She let it exist without resistance, honoring both the love that had once been real and the necessity of the distance that had followed. She did not romanticize the past, nor did she reduce it to its failures. Instead, she accepted it as part of a larger story, one that had shaped her but did not define her entirely. Closure, she learned, was not something another person could give her, nor something she could reclaim through hindsight. It was something she built slowly, through acceptance rather than certainty. Time continued, as it always did, indifferent to what it left behind. The world moved forward, carrying new stories, new moments, new lives into focus. Yet within that movement, the echo of those 8 days remained, not as a punishment, but as a reminder of how closely love and loss could exist, separated sometimes by nothing more than a decision made in good faith. What Priscilla came to understand was not that she should have chosen differently, but that every choice carried a weight that could only be fully measured after time had spoken. And so what remained was not just regret, but wisdom earned at a cost, a deeper compassion for the complexity of human relationships, and an enduring respect for the power of moments that ask everything of us without promising clarity in return. The silence she had once feared no longer haunted her. It informed her. It became part of the language through which she understood her own life, a reminder that some endings do not offer answers, only the responsibility to live honestly with what has been chosen.